The whispers grew louder as Nora Ellis stepped off the stagecoach. Her swollen belly visible beneath the threadbare shawl she clutched around herself, attempting to shield both her unborn child and her dignity from the curious stares of Nogales, Arizona's residents on that sweltering June day in 1878. The dusty frontier town of Nogales sat nestled against the Mexican border, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where desperate souls came seeking new beginnings. Nora had not chosen this place, it had been chosen for her. After being cast out by her family back in Philadelphia when they discovered her condition, the 22-year-old had nowhere else to go. Her meager funds had run out in Tucson, forcing her to accept the charity of a missionary woman who paid for her passage to Nogales, where she knew another charitable soul who might help. But that woman had died 3 weeks before Nora's arrival, leaving her with no connections and no prospects in a town where she knew no one. Now, 7 months pregnant and completely alone, Nora stood on the main street, her trunk beside her, wondering how she would survive the night, let alone the weeks until her baby arrived. "Miss, you best get yourself out of this heat," the stagecoach driver said, tipping his hat as he handed her the small carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. "Town Hotel is just down the way. Tell Mrs. Paulson that Charlie sent you. She might give you a fair rate." Nora nodded gratefully, though she knew her remaining coins wouldn't cover even a single night's stay. As the stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, she became acutely aware of the stares from the townspeople going about their business. Women pulled their children closer as they passed. Men averted their eyes, or worse, let them linger too long on her belly. An unmarried woman in her condition was a walking scandal, especially in a frontier town where propriety was sometimes the only thing separating civilization from lawlessness. She made her way down the rutted dirt street, past the general store, the sheriff's office, and the saloon, from which piano music and raucous laughter spilled into the afternoon air. The sound of hammering rang out from somewhere nearby. The town was growing, with new buildings rising where once there had been only open space. Nogales was a town of opportunity for some. For Nora, it felt like the end of the line. After inquiring at the hotel and confirming her fears about the cost, she found herself sitting on a bench outside the general store, wondering what to do next. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and her back ached from the long journey. The baby kicked inside her, as if reminding her that decisions could no longer be made for herself alone. "Auctions starting in an hour, miss," a young boy said as he passed, handing her a crudely printed flyer. "They're selling off all of old man Wilson's property since he died. Might be worth a look." Nora accepted the paper without much interest, until her eyes caught on a particular line. "Positions available for household staff, cook, housekeeper, laundress to be contracted to highest bidder." Her heart quickened. She had worked as a governess back in Philadelphia before her disgrace, and though she had little experience as a domestic servant, she was willing to learn. Perhaps someone would hire her despite her condition, if only for a few weeks until the baby came. It was her only hope. By the time Nora arrived at the auction site, a crowd had already gathered in the shade of a large oak tree behind the courthouse. A makeshift platform had been constructed, and various items from the Wilson estate were arranged for inspection. Furniture, farming equipment, horses, and even a wagon were to be sold to the highest bidder. She stood at the back of the crowd, trying to make herself inconspicuous, which was nearly impossible given her condition. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice, worked through the items efficiently. Nora waited, anxiety mounting, until finally he announced the positions available in the Wilson household. "Now, folks, as you know, Old Ezra Wilson's place is one of the finest in the territory. Whoever buys that property's gonna need help running it. We've got 3 positions available: cook, housekeeper, and laundress. These are year-long contracts, as per Mr. Wilson's instructions before his passing. Starting bid is $20 for the cook, $15 for the housekeeper, and $10 for the laundress. Nora stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Sir," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady despite her nerves, "I'd like to be considered for the position of housekeeper." The crowd parted and all eyes turned to her. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose and he cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Madam, these are binding contracts for a year's service. Your condition suggests you might not be able to fulfill such obligations." Heat rose to Nora's cheeks as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Women exchanged glances of disapproval, and men shuffled their feet awkwardly. "I'm stronger than I look," Nora insisted, stepping closer to the platform. "I can work until my time comes and resume duties shortly after. I'm a quick learner and not afraid of hard work." The auctioneer looked skeptical but seemed unwilling to turn her away outright. "Well, I suppose that would be up to whoever hires you. Any takers for this young woman as housekeeper? Starting bid $15. The silence that followed was devastating. Nora felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her more heavily than the afternoon sun. Not a single person raised a hand. "Perhaps as laundress then," the auctioneer suggested, his tone now tinged with pity. "Starting at $10. Again, silence fell. Nora's cheeks burned with humiliation and she felt tears threatening. She would not cry here, not in front of these people. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, even as shame coursed through her. Just as she was about to turn and leave, a deep voice called from the edge of the crowd. $100. A collective gasp rose from the gathered townspeople. Nora turned to see who had spoken. A tall man stood at the back, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. As he stepped forward, the crowd parted for him. He was dressed like a rancher, worn boots, dusty trousers, a simple shirt with a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. When he came closer, Nora could make out a strong jawline covered with a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes the color of a summer storm. Mr. Prescott," the auctioneer stammered, "did I hear you correctly? $100 for the young lady as laundress." "You heard me, Jenkins," the man Prescott replied, "but not as laundress, as housekeeper for the Circle P Ranch." The crowd broke into whispers and murmurs. Nora stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. $100 was an outrageous sum for a year's contract, nearly 7 times the starting bid. "Well now," Jenkins the auctioneer said, recovering his professional demeanor, "that's a mighty generous offer. Do I hear any other bids for this young lady's services as housekeeper?" The silence that followed confirmed what everyone already knew: no one would compete with Yates Prescott's bid. "Sold, then, to Mr. Prescott for $100. The auctioneer banged his gavel, and just like that, Nora's immediate future was decided. The man called Prescott approached her, and now she could see his face clearly. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun. There was something gentle about his expression, despite his imposing presence. "Miss, I'm Yates Prescott," he said, his voice lower now that he was speaking directly to her. "I own the Circle P Ranch about 5 miles north of town. I'm in need of a housekeeper, and you look like you could use the position." Nora swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. Was this man truly offering her salvation or something else? She'd learned the hard way that men's kindness often came with expectations. "Why would you pay so much?" she asked bluntly, her voice barely above a whisper, especially for someone in my situation. A small smile touched his lips. Because you had the courage to stand up there knowing what folks would say, and because everyone deserves a chance. He paused, then added, the job is just that, a job. You'll have your own quarters, meals provided, and fair treatment. Nothing more expected than honest work when you're able. Nora studied his face, searching for deceit and finding none. Whatever his reasons, Yates Prescott was offering her shelter, income, and a chance to keep her child. It was more than she dared hope for. I accept your offer, Mr. Prescott, she said finally, extending her hand as if to seal a business arrangement. He took her hand briefly, his calloused palm warm against hers. Good. My wagon's over yonder. If you've got belongings, I'll help you with them. As they walked away from the auction, Nora felt the stares of the townspeople burning into her back. She knew what they were thinking. What kind of man pays that much for a pregnant, unmarried woman? What were his true intentions? She held her head high, refusing to let their judgment crush her. For the first time in months, she had hope, however uncertain it might be. The wagon ride to the Circle P ranch was largely silent. Yates Prescott wasn't a man of many words, it seemed, and Nora was too overwhelmed by the day's events to make conversation. The landscape around Nogales unfolded before her, rolling hills covered in scrub brush. Occasional stands of cottonwood trees marking the presence of water, distant mountains purple against the setting sun. It was beautiful in its harsh way, so different from the verdant Pennsylvania countryside she'd known all her life. As they crested a hill, Yates gestured ahead. There it is, Circle P. The ranch spread out before them in the valley below, a large main house built of adobe and wood, several outbuildings, corrals full of horses, and vast stretches of grazing land beyond. It was impressive, far larger than Nora had expected. You run all this yourself? She asked, breaking the silence. Got 8 ranch hands, he replied. Good men. They bunk in the bunkhouse yonder. Main house has just been me since my housekeeper left to get married last month. He glanced at her. They won't bother you none. Ranch hands aren't allowed in the main house except on special occasions. As they pulled up to the house, an older Mexican woman emerged from the kitchen door, wiping her hands on her apron. This is Margarita, Yates said as he helped Nora down from the wagon. She comes in 3 days a week to cook. Doesn't speak much English, but she's been with the ranch longer than I have. Margarita's dark eyes took in Nora's condition, but her weathered face revealed nothing of her thoughts as she nodded a greeting. Margarita. Esta es Señorita Ellis. Ella va a ser la nueva ama de Laves, Yates explained in surprisingly fluid Spanish. Then, turning to Nora, he added, I told her you're the new housekeeper. She'll show you to your quarters. With that, he lifted her carpet bag and trunk from the wagon and carried them into the house. Nora followed, led by Margarita, into a spacious adobe structure that was mercifully cool after the heat of the day. The interior was simply but comfortably furnished, with sturdy wooden furniture, colorful woven rugs, and large windows that caught the breeze. Margarita led her down a hallway to a small but pleasant room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a rocking chair placed near the window that overlooked a kitchen garden. Yates set her belongings down and stepped back. Get settled in. Margarita's fixing supper. We eat at 7, he said, then hesitated as if wanting to say more. Instead, he simply nodded and left, his boot heels echoing on the wooden floor. When he was gone, Nora sank onto the bed, exhaustion washing over her. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. We have a roof over our heads, she whispered. For now, at least, we're safe. That night, seated across from Yates Prescott at his large kitchen table, Nora learned more about her new employer. He had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years earlier, expanding it into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. He was 34, had never married, and seemed to prefer the company of his horses and cattle to people, though he was unfailingly polite. "Your duties will be straightforward," he explained as Margarita served a simple but hearty stew. "Keep the house in order, do the laundry when you're able and after the baby." He cleared his throat. "After your child arrives, you can work out a schedule that suits you both." "You're very kind, Mr. Prescott," Nora said quietly. "Most wouldn't be so accommodating to a woman in my situation." He looked at her directly, his gray eyes steady. "I judge folks by their character, not their circumstances, Miss Ellis. We've all got stories. Some just show more plainly than others." With that enigmatic statement, he turned the conversation to practical matters: where to find household supplies, which areas of the ranch were off limits, and when the ranch hands would be away on cattle drives. By the time supper ended, Nora had a clear understanding of her responsibilities and the freedom she would have within the confines of her position. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the coyotes howling in the distance, Nora reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Yesterday, she'd been a desperate woman with nowhere to go. Today, she had a job, a roof over her head, and the promise of safety for her child. She didn't know what had prompted Yates Prescott to show such unexpected kindness to a stranger, but she was determined to prove worthy of it. The following days established a routine. Nora rose early, preparing coffee before Yates went out to work with his men. She spent mornings cleaning the main rooms of the house, afternoons doing mending or other light work, and evenings preparing for the next day. When Margarita came, she observed the older woman's cooking techniques, eager to learn. Her body grew heavier as the baby developed, but she pushed through the discomfort, determined to earn her keep. Yates was often absent during the day, working the ranch, but they shared evening meals when he wasn't too exhausted. Their conversations were initially stilted, but gradually became more comfortable as Nora discovered that beneath his reserved exterior was a thoughtful, intelligent man with a dry sense of humor. "How'd you end up in Nogales?" he asked one evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival. "Not many Easterners find their way here, especially not alone." Nora hesitated, setting down her fork. She'd been waiting for this question, dreading it. "I had nowhere else to go," she answered honestly. "My family, they couldn't accept my situation. They gave me a choice: give up my baby when it's born or leave their home." "So you left everything you knew?" "Yes." She met his gaze, challenging him to judge her. "I couldn't give up my child." Instead of censure, she saw respect in his eyes. "That took courage." "Not courage," she corrected him. "Necessity. This baby is innocent of any wrongdoing I couldn't punish it for my mistakes." He was quiet for a moment, studying her. And the question struck her like a physical blow. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. He was married. "I didn't know until it was too late. When I told him about the baby, he denied everything, said I was trying to blackmail him." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. "He was an important man in Philadelphia society. No one would have believed me over him." She waited for the judgment, the disappointment that always came when people learned the truth. Instead, Yates simply nodded. "Some men don't deserve the title," he said quietly. "Your child is lucky to have a mother willing to sacrifice everything for them." His simple statement, free of condemnation, loosened something tight inside Nora's chest. For the first time in months, she felt seen as a person, not just as the embodiment of her shame. As July turned to August, the Arizona heat intensified. Nora's pregnancy advanced, making even simple tasks exhausting. One particularly brutal afternoon, Yates returned to the house to find her slumped in a chair, face pale and beaded with sweat, as she struggled to fold laundry. Without a word, he crossed to her, took the sheets from her hands and set them aside. "You're done for today." "I'm fine, I just needed to rest a moment," she protested weakly. "You're not fine," he countered, his voice firm but gentle. "You're working too hard. From now on, I want you to rest in the afternoons. Mr. Prescott, you hired me to work. I won't take advantage of your kindness." His expression softened. "Nora, you clean this house more thoroughly than it's ever been cleaned. You've mended every torn shirt I own. You've reorganized the pantry so efficiently that even Margarita is impressed." A small smile touched his lips. "You've more than earned an afternoon rest." The use of her first name startled her. In the weeks she'd been at the ranch, he'd consistently called her Miss Ellis, maintaining a respectful distance between employer and employee. "Thank you, Yates," she replied hesitantly, testing the familiarity. Something shifted in his eyes, a warmth that made her heart beat faster. But the moment passed quickly as he cleared his throat and stepped back. "I'll have one of the boys bring up a basin of cool water for you," he said, returning to his more formal manner. "Try to stay comfortable." That evening, a thunderstorm broke the heat. Nora sat on the covered porch, watching lightning illuminate the distant mountains as rain drummed on the roof. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone, a cleansing scent after weeks of dust and dryness. Yates joined her, offering a cup of herbal tea. "Margarita says it's good for the baby," he explained, settling into the chair beside her. They sat in companionable silence, watching the storm. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the ranch in stark white light, followed by a deep rumble of thunder. "I've always loved storms," Nora confessed. "Back in Philadelphia, I used to sneak out onto the balcony during thunderstorms, even though my mother forbade it. There's something so powerful, so alive about them." "Out here, they're life itself," Yates replied. "The difference between drought and prosperity." He paused, watching the rain sweep across the yard. "First time I saw a desert bloom after the monsoon rains, I couldn't believe my eyes. All that color erupting from what looked like dead earth." The way he spoke, with quiet passion about the land he loved, stirred something in Nora. There was poetry in this taciturn rancher, hidden beneath his practical exterior. "How did your family come to this place?" she asked, genuinely curious. He took a sip of his coffee before answering. "My father was a dreamer. Came west after the war with nothing but ambition and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Met my mother in Tucson. She was a schoolteacher from Boston who came west for adventure. They built this place together, fought Apache raids, drought, rustlers, anything the territory could throw at them." Pride and sadness mingled in his voice. "Lost my mother to fever when I was 12. Father raised me alone after that, taught me everything about ranching, about being a man." "He must have been a good teacher," Nora observed softly. "You've built something remarkable here." Yates looked at her, surprise evident in his expression, as if unused to receiving compliments. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "What about your family, before everything happened?" Nora sighed, memories washing over her like the rain outside. "My father is a banker. Very respected, very proper. My mother's entire life revolves around Philadelphia society, who's invited to which dinner parties, whose daughter made the best match. I have 2 younger sisters who are already better at navigating that world than I ever was." She smiled wistfully. "I was always the odd one, too bookish, too outspoken. When I took the governess position, my mother was mortified that a daughter of hers would work for wages, but I loved it. Teaching children, watching them discover the world." It felt meaningful in a way that tea parties and gossip never did. Is that what you hope to do again someday? Teach? The question startled her. She'd been so focused on survival, on getting through the pregnancy, that she'd barely thought about what would come after. I don't know, she answered honestly. Who would hire a fallen woman with a child born out of wedlock? Someone who values intelligence and kindness over gossip, Yates replied without hesitation. This territory needs good teachers. Once the baby is older, you might find opportunities you wouldn't back east. His words offered a glimpse of a future. Nora hadn't dared imagine one where she and her child might build a life with dignity, despite the circumstances of its birth. She felt tears prickling behind her eyes and blinked them away. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for giving me a chance when no one else would. He turned to her, his expression serious. Everyone deserves a second chance, Nora. Sometimes life deals a harsh hand. Doesn't mean the game is over. As September approached, Nora's time grew near. Yates arranged for the local midwife, a formidable widow named Mrs. Donovan, to visit the ranch and assess Nora's condition. First baby? The older woman asked, after examining Nora in the privacy of her bedroom. Yes, Nora replied nervously. Is the baby all right? Healthy as can be, Mrs. Donovan assured her, washing her hands in the basin. Strong heartbeat, good position. I'd say you've got about 3 weeks, give or take. She eyed Nora shrewdly. Mr. Prescott treating you proper? Yes, of course, Nora answered quickly. He's been nothing but kind and respectful. Mrs. Donovan nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. Man's got a reputation for fairness, but I had to ask. Not every unmarried girl in your condition ends up in such a fortunate situation. She packed her things efficiently. I'll come by every few days now to check on you. When your time comes, send one of the ranch hands to fetch me. I'm never more than 20 minutes away. After the midwife left, Nora found Yates waiting in the kitchen, his expression concerned. Everything all right? Yes, she confirmed. Mrs. Donovan says the baby is healthy, about 3 more weeks. Relief washed over his features. Good. That's good. He hesitated, then added, I've been thinking. The room next to yours, it's small, but it would make a good nursery. I could have the men bring in a cradle. Old Ben Peterson's daughter left one behind when they moved to California. Nora's heart swelled at his thoughtfulness. That would be wonderful, thank you, and I was wondering. He seemed uncharacteristically uncertain. What will you name the child? The question caught her off guard. She'd thought about it, of course, but hadn't shared her thoughts with anyone. If it's a boy, I thought perhaps Samuel, after my grandfather. For a girl, she smiled softly. Elizabeth, it means God's promise. Yates nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. Good, strong names. As the days passed, a subtle shift occurred between them. Yates spent more time at the house, making sure Nora had everything she needed. He brought wildflowers from the hills to brighten her room, carried water for her bath, and even read aloud to her in the evenings when she was too tired to hold a book herself. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold and crimson, Nora caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. What is it? She asked. He seemed embarrassed to be caught staring. Just thinking that motherhood suits you. You've got a kind of glow, she laughed softly. I believe that's just perspiration. September in Arizona isn't kind to a woman in my condition. No, he insisted gently. It's more than that. You're stronger than you know, Nora Ellis. His words warmed her more than the evening sun. Over the past months, as her body had grown heavier with child, she'd felt increasingly unattractive. To have this man, this kind, honorable man, look at her with admiration rather than pity was a balm to her battered self-worth. 2 days later, just as Nora was setting out linens to air, She felt a sharp pain low in her belly. She grabbed the door frame, waiting for it to pass. When it did, she dismissed it as practice contractions, which she'd been experiencing for weeks. But an hour later, another came, stronger than before, and she knew. She found Yates in the barn, discussing the day's work with his foreman. "It's time," she said simply when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as terrified as she felt. Then his practical nature took over. "Miguel," he barked to his foreman, "ride for Mrs. Donovan. Tell her Miss Ellis's time has come." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Mrs. Donovan arrived quickly, taking charge with calm efficiency. Margarita boiled water and prepared clean linens. Yates paced the hallway outside Nora's room, flinching each time he heard her cry out. As the sun set and the room grew dim, Mrs. Donovan lit lamps and wiped Nora's brow with cool cloths. "You're doing fine, girl," she said encouragingly. "Baby's coming along just as it should." Nora had never known such pain, nor such determination. Each contraction seemed to tear her apart, yet she bore down, focusing on the life struggling to enter the world. "I can't," she gasped after a particularly vicious pain. "I can't do this." "Nonsense," the midwife said briskly. "Women have been doing this since Eve. You're stronger than the pain." Outside, Yates had given up pacing and sat with his back against the wall beside Nora's door, head in his hands. Every sound from within the room was a knife to his heart. He'd grown to care deeply for the courageous young woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Miguel found him there and offered a flask. "Tequila," the foreman said simply. "It helps." Yates accepted it gratefully, taking a long pull of the fiery liquid. "Gracias, amigo. La señorita," Miguel said hesitantly. "She is special to you, no?" Yates looked up at his trusted foreman, a man who had worked beside him for years. "Yes," he admitted for the first time, perhaps even to himself. "She is." Miguel nodded sagely. "Then you pray to the Virgin for her. The Virgin watches over mothers." As midnight approached, Nora's labor intensified. Mrs. Donovan positioned her for the final stage, and with a series of tremendous efforts, Nora pushed her child into the world. A boy. The midwife announced triumphantly, holding up the squalling infant. "A fine, healthy boy." Tears streamed down Nora's face as the baby was quickly cleaned, wrapped, and placed in her arms. He had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face that she thought was the most beautiful sight she'd ever beheld. "Samuel," she whispered, tracing a finger along his tiny cheek. "My Samuel." After ensuring that both mother and child were well, Mrs. Donovan stepped into the hallway where Yates still waited anxiously. "Congratulations," she said with a knowing smile. "Miss Ellis has a healthy son. They're both doing just fine." Relief flooded through him, so powerful that for a moment he couldn't speak. Would it be proper for me to see them?" The midwife studied him thoughtfully, then nodded. "Just for a moment. The new mama needs her rest." Yates entered the room cautiously. Nora lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant as she cradled the small bundle in her arms. When she looked up and saw him, her smile was luminous. "Yates," she said softly, "meet Samuel." He approached the bed, overwhelmed by the tableau before him. Nora, exhausted but triumphant, and the tiny new life she had brought into the world. As he looked down at the infant's face, something shifted inside him, a protective instinct so powerful it took his breath away. "He's perfect," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "Would you like to hold him?" Nora offered, startled. Yates hesitated. "I don't know how. I might drop him." "You won't," she assured him, and carefully transferred the swaddled infant to his arms. The weight of the child was nothing, yet it seemed to fill some empty space inside Yates he hadn't known existed. Samuel squirmed slightly, then settled, his tiny face relaxed in sleep. Yates felt a surge of protectiveness, so fierce it almost frightened him. "Thank you," Nora whispered, watching them, "for everything, for giving us a chance." Yates looked from the child to his mother, and in that moment he knew with absolute certainty that these two had claimed a permanent place in his heart. In the weeks that followed Samuel's birth, life at the Circle P settled into a new rhythm. Nora recovered quickly, her natural resilience asserting itself. Baby Samuel proved to be a generally contented infant, though his lungs were certainly healthy, as he demonstrated during midnight feedings. Yates found himself increasingly drawn to the domestic scene in his once lonely house. He'd return from working the range and linger in the doorway of the nursery, watching Nora rock Samuel to sleep. Sometimes she'd sing softly, old lullabies from her childhood, her voice sweet and clear in the quiet evening air. One night, about 3 weeks after Samuel's birth, Yates found Nora on the porch, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. The October air had a hint of crispness, and she had wrapped a shawl around them both. "May I join you?" he asked, indicating the empty chair beside her. "Of course." She smiled up at him, and his heart did that strange flip it had started doing whenever she looked at him that way. He settled beside her, content to share the peaceful moment. Above them, stars scattered across the in-sky sky like diamonds on black velvet, more stars than could ever be seen in a city. "I've been thinking," Nora said after a companionable silence. "It's time I started earning my keep again. Samuel's doing well and I'm fully recovered." "There's no rush," Yates assured her. "You take all the time you need." She shook her head. "You've been more than generous, but I want to contribute. I need to build a future for Samuel and myself." Yates hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "What kind of future do you see, Nora? Here in Arizona territory?" She looked out at the darkened landscape, considering. "I didn't plan to stay in Nogales," she admitted. "It was just where the stage brought me." "But now—" Her gaze returned to his face. "This place has become home in a way I never expected." Hope flared in Yates's chest. "I'm glad to hear that," he said carefully. "The territory can be hard, but it's a good place to raise a child. Room to grow, to become whoever you're meant to be without the weight of others' expectations." Nora looked down at Samuel, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "That's what I want for him. A chance to be judged on his own merits, not on the circumstances of his birth." "He'll have that here," Yates promised. Then, gathering his courage, he added, "Nora, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." The seriousness of his tone made her look up, a question in her eyes. "What is it?" "Our arrangement was for a year," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But I've been thinking about what happens after that year ends." Her expression grew guarded. "I've thought about that too." "I don't want you to leave," he said simply. "Either of you," her breath caught. "Yates." "Please let me finish," he said gently. "These past months, watching you face every challenge with grace and courage, seeing your devotion to Samuel, your kindness to everyone around you, I've come to care for you, Nora, deeply." He saw hope and fear warring in her expression. "As an employee?" She asked cautiously. "No," he smiled, reaching out to take her free hand. "As a woman, a remarkable woman I've grown to admire and love." The last word hung between them, momentous and transformative. Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull her hand away. "I know it's sudden," Yates continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I know you came here under difficult circumstances, and the last thing I want is for you to feel obligated in any way. But I want you to know that if you choose to stay, it wouldn't be as my housekeeper. It would be as my wife." A tear slipped down Nora's cheek. Yates, do you understand what you're offering? A woman with my past, with a child born out of wedlock. People will talk. Let them, he said firmly. I've never much cared what people say. I care about what's in a person's heart, and yours is the finest I've ever known. And Samuel, she asked, looking down at the sleeping infant, you would take him as your own, with pride, Yates answered without hesitation. I already love him, Nora, from the moment you placed him in my arms. She drew a shaky breath, overwhelmed by his declaration. I need you to be certain, she said. This isn't a decision to make lightly. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, he assured her, squeezing her hand gently, but I don't expect an answer tonight. Take all the time you need. Just know that my heart and my home are yours whenever you're ready. With that, he rose, pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and left her to her thoughts, knowing that the future he hoped for was in her hands. Nora sat long into the night, Samuel sleeping peacefully against her chest, considering Yates's unexpected proposal. Part of her heart sang with joy. This honorable, kind man loved her, wanted to make her his wife, to give her child his name. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd stepped off that stage in Nogales. But doubt lingered. Was she truly ready for marriage? Did she love Yates, or was she simply grateful for his kindness? And what of the future? Would he someday regret taking on another man's child? A woman with a tarnished reputation. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, Nora finally knew her answer. She waited until after breakfast, when Samuel was fed and content in his cradle, to seek out Yates. She found him in the barn, consulting with Miguel about a sick horse. When he saw her standing in the doorway, he excused himself immediately and came to her side. Good morning, he said, his voice gentle. Did you sleep well? Hardly at all, she admitted with a small smile. I had a lot to think about. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Nora, I meant what I said about taking your time. She placed a finger against his lips, silencing him. I've had enough time, Yates. I know my heart. Taking a deep breath, she continued. When I arrived in Nogales, I was broken, ashamed, with nothing to offer but my willingness to work. You saw beyond my circumstances to the woman I am. You gave me dignity when others would have only seen disgrace. His eyes never left her face, intent on her every word. These months at Circle P have healed something in me I thought was permanently broken, she continued. I've found strength I didn't know I possessed, and peace I never expected to feel again. And you, her voice softened. You've shown me what a good man truly is, not through grand gestures, but through daily kindness, through respect and understanding. She took his weathered hands in hers. Yes, Yates Prescott. Yes, I will marry you, not out of gratitude or necessity, but because I love you. Because I cannot imagine my life or Samuel's without you in it. Joy transformed his features, making him look younger, almost boyish in his happiness. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When he finally drew back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. You've made me the happiest man in the territory, he said hoarsely. I promise you won't regret it, Nora. I'll spend every day making sure of that. 2 weeks later, on a crisp November morning, Nora Ellis became Nora Prescott in a simple ceremony performed by the local justice of the peace. The entire ranch turned out for the occasion, along with a surprising number of townspeople who had gradually warmed to Nora as they witnessed her determination and character. Mrs. Donovan held Samuel, who behaved impeccably throughout the proceedings, as if understanding the significance of the day. Yates had commissioned a gold band from a silversmith in Tucson, and as he slid it onto Nora's finger, his hand was steady, his voice clear as he spoke the words that bound them together. Nora wore a simple dress of pale blue silk, Yates's gift, ordered all the way from San Francisco, and her eyes shone with happiness as she promised to love, honor, and cherish him for all their days. Afterward, there was a celebration at the ranch. Margarita and several women from town had prepared a feast, and the ranch hands had constructed long tables under the cottonwood trees. There was music, dancing, and more genuine good wishes than Nora had dared hope for. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Yates found his bride sitting slightly apart, watching the celebration with Samuel sleeping in her arms. "Happy, Mrs. Prescott?" he asked, sitting beside her and draping an arm around her shoulders. The name, her new name, brought a fresh wave of joy. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "This is just the beginning, Nora. We have a lifetime ahead of us." She leaned into his solid strength, marveling at how much had changed in just a few months. From a pregnant, desperate woman standing alone at an auction, to a wife, a mother, a woman with a future bright with promise. "A lifetime," she echoed, smiling up at him. "I like the sound of that." The years that followed proved Yates's promise true. The Circle P prospered under his guidance, and the main house, once so spare and utilitarian, became a true home filled with warmth and laughter. Samuel grew from a baby to a sturdy toddler, following Yates everywhere, his small boots leaving tracks beside his father's larger ones. For that was what Yates became, a father in every sense that mattered. He taught Samuel to ride almost before the boy could walk, hoisting him up on gentle ponies, his strong hands ensuring he wouldn't fall. At night, it was often Yates who read bedtime stories, creating funny voices for each character that made Samuel giggle uncontrollably. The day Samuel first called Yates Papa, both Nora and Yates had tears in their eyes. It wasn't something they had coached him to say, it came naturally, as the bond between them grew. Yates had lifted the boy high, his face alight with joy, and Nora had known with absolute certainty that her son would never lack for a father's love. In the spring of 1881, just as Samuel was approaching his 3rd birthday, Nora discovered she was expecting again. She told Yates one evening as they sat on their favorite porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "A baby," he repeated, his expression shifting from surprise to absolute delight. "Are you certain, Mrs.?" "Donovan confirmed it this afternoon," Nora replied, smiling at his reaction. "She says I'm about 2 months along. The baby should arrive in late October." Yates gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that still made her heart race after nearly 3 years of marriage. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for this gift for Samuel, for everything you've brought into my life." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and on a crisp autumn night, with Margarita watching over a sleeping Samuel, Nora gave birth to a daughter. They named her Catherine, after Yates's mother, and from the moment she arrived, with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Samuel approached his new sister with solemn curiosity, peering into her cradle with his serious brown eyes. "She's very small, Mama," he observed. "You were that small once too," Nora told him, smoothing his dark curls. "And now you're my big, strong boy who's going to help take care of his sister." The role of big brother suited Samuel perfectly. As Catherine grew, he became her protector and playmate, teaching her all the important things a girl on a ranch should know: where the best blackberries grew, how to call the chickens for feeding, which horses were gentle enough for children. Yates expanded the ranch, buying adjoining property when it became available, until the Circle P was one of the largest operations in the territory. But his true pride was his family. He would often pause in his work to watch Nora with the children, Samuel, now a lanky boy with his mother's thoughtful nature, Catherine, a spirited girl with her father's determined streak, and marvel at how his life had been transformed. In 1887, when the children were 9 and 6, a letter arrived from Philadelphia that changed everything. Nora's father had died suddenly, leaving her a substantial inheritance. More shocking than the money was the accompanying letter from her mother, expressing regret for the estrangement and a desire to meet her grandchildren. "What will you do?" Yates asked that night, after the children were asleep, and they sat before the fire, the letter lying open between them. Nora was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might reveal the answer. "I think we should go," she said finally. "Not to stay, our life is here, but the children should meet their grandmother, and perhaps it's time for healing." The journey east was an adventure for the children, who had never ventured beyond Arizona territory. They traveled by train. Samuel and Catherine pressed against the windows, exclaiming over each new sight. Nora watched their excitement, remembering her own desperate journey west years before, and marveled at how different this return was, not as a shamed, pregnant girl, but as a confident woman with a loving husband and 2 beautiful children. Philadelphia in spring was, as Nora remembered, elegant, cultured, and far removed from the rugged simplicity of their ranch life. The Ellis family home on Rittenhouse Square stood as imposing as ever, its brick facade and polished brass fixtures speaking of old money and established position. Margaret Ellis, now a widow in her early 60s, met them at the door. She was thinner than Nora remembered, her hair now completely silver, but her back was straight, her bearing still proud. For a long moment, mother and daughter regarded each other, a decade of separation stretching between them like a vast canyon. Then Margaret's composure cracked. "Nora," she whispered, opening her arms. "My dear girl." The embrace that followed was healing, a bridge across years of hurt and misunderstanding. As they drew apart, Margaret knelt to greet her grandchildren, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Samuel," she said, taking the boy's hand, "you have your mother's eyes." Then, turning to Catherine, "And you, my dear, are the image of your father." Catherine, never shy, stepped forward. "Mama says you have a garden. May I see it?" Margaret laughed, a sound Nora realized she had rarely heard in childhood. "Yes, indeed. And perhaps you'll help me pick some flowers for the dinner table." The visit lasted 2 weeks, during which old wounds began to heal. Margaret Ellis was not a demonstrative woman by nature, but she made an effort with her grandchildren, showing Samuel her late husband's library of leather-bound classics, teaching Catherine to play simple melodies on the grand piano in the parlor. Most surprising to Nora was her mother's relationship with Yates. Margaret had initially regarded her son-in-law with polite reserve, perhaps expecting a rough, uneducated cowboy. But Yates's natural dignity, intelligence, and obvious devotion to Nora quickly won her respect. "You were right to follow your heart," Margaret told Nora on their last evening, as they sat in the garden watching Yates push the children on the old swing that had hung from the oak tree since Nora's childhood. "He's a good man. Far better than—" She stopped, unwilling even now to speak of the married man who had fathered Samuel. "I know, Mother," Nora said gently, "and yes, he is the best man I've ever known." Margaret's hand found hers, a tentative gesture of reconciliation. "Will you write, perhaps visit again?" "Yes," Nora promised. "And you must come to the ranch, see our home, our life there." The invitation was sincere, though Nora couldn't imagine her elegant mother in the rough and tumble world of the Arizona territory. To her surprise, Margaret nodded. "I'd like that," she said, and for the first time, Nora believed a true relationship with her mother might be possible. They returned to the Circle P in early summer, the children full of stories about their Eastern adventure, but clearly happy to be home. As the stagecoach pulled up to the ranch house, the familiar sight of the adobe walls glowing in the sunset, the mountains purple in the distance, filled Nora with a profound sense of belonging. "Welcome home, Mrs. Prescott," Yates said, helping her down from the coach, his hands lingering at her waist. "It's good to be back," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Philadelphia is beautiful, but this—" She gestured to the wide, open landscape, the vast sky, the place they had built together. "This is where I belong, with you." That night, after the children were asleep, exhausted from their journey, Nora and Yates sat on their porch swing, listening to the night sounds of the desert coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves, the occasional nicker of horses in the corral. "I've been thinking," Yates said, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, "about what your mother said about education for the children." During their visit, Margaret had expressed concern about Samuel and Catherine's schooling, which until now had consisted of lessons from Nora and occasional sessions with the circuit teacher who visited Nogales every few months. "I think she's right," Nora admitted. "They need more than I can give them, especially as they get older." "What would you think about building a proper school?" Yates suggested. "Not just for our children, but for all the ranch children and those from neighboring properties. We have the land, and with your inheritance, we could hire a qualified teacher, maybe even build a small library." Nora sat up, looking at him with growing excitement. "Yates, that's a wonderful idea. There are at least a dozen children within riding distance who have limited access to education. We could make a real difference." He smiled, pleased by her enthusiasm. "I thought you might like the idea. You've always had a teacher's heart, Nora." The Prescott School opened its doors in January of 1888. A simple but well-constructed building of adobe and wood, with large windows to catch the winter sunlight and shelves lined with books ordered from San Francisco and Philadelphia. Miss Henderson, a young teacher from Boston, arrived on the stage, eager to bring education to the frontier, and the school quickly became the pride of the area. Nora took an active role, assisting with lessons, organizing a lending library for adults, and eventually teaching classes herself when the school's enrollment grew beyond what Miss Henderson could manage alone. Working with children again brought her joy, fulfilling the dream she'd had as a young governess in Philadelphia. Life at the Circle P settled into a rhythm marked by the seasons, the school calendar, and the cattle drives that took Yates away periodically. The children grew, thriving in the freedom of ranch life while receiving an education that would prepare them for whatever future they might choose. When Samuel turned 15, Yates officially changed the ranch brand to Circle PS, incorporating his son's initial. "This will be yours someday," he told the boy as they rode the property line together. "Yours and Catherine's. I want you to know every inch of it." Samuel, now tall and lanky like his father, with Nora's thoughtful brown eyes, nodded solemnly. "I'll make you proud, Pa." Yates reached across the space between their horses to clasp his son's shoulder. "You already do, son. Every day." That same year, Margaret Ellis made good on her promise to visit the ranch. At 70, she was still formidable, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her traveling suit impeccable despite the dust of the journey. But age had softened her, and she embraced ranch life with surprising enthusiasm, accepting the simpler accommodations, the informal meals, and even, to everyone's astonishment, learning to ride a gentle mare Yates selected for her. "I can see why you love it here," she told Nora as they watched the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "There's a freedom to this place, a sense of possibility." "That's exactly what drew me," Nora agreed, linking her arm through her mother's. "That, and the man who showed me I could start again." Margaret stayed for a month, developing a close relationship with her grandchildren and even befriending Margarita, despite their language barrier. When she departed, there were tears all around and promises of future visits. Life wasn't without challenges. The winter of 1891 brought devastating blizzards that killed much of the Circle Pitakes herd. Drought followed, making recovery difficult. There were disputes with neighboring ranchers over water rights, cattle rustlers to contend with, and the usual hardships of frontier life. But through it all, the family remained strong, facing each challenge together. As the century drew to a close, changes came to the Arizona Territory. The railroad expanded, bringing more settlers. Nogales grew from a small frontier outpost to a bustling border town. Talk of statehood was in the air, and with it, a sense that the wild, free days of the frontier were coming to an end. Yates and Nora watched these changes with mixed feelings. Progress brought conveniences. They appreciated better medical care, more regular mail service, easier access to goods from the East. But they also valued the independence, the self-reliance that had shaped their lives and their children's. In 1897, Samuel, now 19, announced his intention to attend the University of California. "I want to learn modern ranching methods," he explained over dinner. "Bring that knowledge back to Circle P." Though Yates had always assumed his son would remain at the ranch, he supported the decision. "Education is never wasted," he said, echoing what Nora had always taught their children. "The ranch will be here when you're ready." Catherine, at 16, had different dreams. Artistic and independent, she spoke of becoming a teacher like her mother, or perhaps a writer. "I want to tell stories of the West," she declared, "before it disappears completely." "Whatever you choose," Nora told her, "make sure it brings you joy. That's what matters most." As they prepared to send their son to university, Nora and Yates found themselves looking back on the journey that had brought them to this point. 20 years had passed since that hot June day when Nora had arrived in Nogales, pregnant and alone, and Yates had bid for her at an auction, offering dignity when others offered only judgment. "You ever regret it?" Nora asked one evening as they sat on their porch swing, gray now threading through both their hair, lines of laughter and experience etched around their eyes. Taking a chance on a stranger with a complicated past. Yates looked at her, his gaze still holding the same warmth, the same admiration it had all those years ago. "Not for a single moment," he answered, taking her hand in his. "That day at the auction. I didn't know it then, but it was the beginning of everything good in my life." Nora leaned against him, feeling the solid strength that had supported her through 2 decades of joy and hardship. "I was so afraid," she confessed, standing there with shame in my eyes, knowing what everyone was thinking. "Then you spoke up, and suddenly there was hope." "You gave me far more than I gave you," Yates said, his voice rough with emotion. "A family, a purpose beyond just working the land, a love I never thought I'd find." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Nora thought about the uncertain girl she had been and the woman she had become. The journey hadn't been easy, but every step had led her here to this man, this family, this life built on courage, kindness, and second chances. "We've been blessed," she said simply, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Yates tightened his arm around her shoulders. "Yes," he agreed, "more than I ever dreamed possible." In the years that followed, the Circle P continued to prosper. Samuel returned from university with new ideas and a bride, a fellow student named Alice who embraced ranch life with enthusiasm. Catherine attended normal school in California, became a teacher, and published stories in magazines that captured the spirit of the vanishing frontier. Margaret Ellis made her home with them in her final years, finding peace in the Western landscape she had once viewed with such skepticism. When she passed peacefully in her sleep at 83, she was surrounded by family who loved her, including 3 great-grandchildren who had brought joy to her later years. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and Nogales celebrated with a grand parade. Yates and Nora, now in their 60s but still active in community affairs, rode in the procession as respected pioneers. Many in the crowd had heard the story of how they met. It had become something of a local legend, embellished over the years but true in its essentials. A desperate young woman, a compassionate rancher, and a bid at an auction that changed both their lives forever. That evening, as fireworks burst overhead in celebration of Arizona's new status, Yates and Nora stood on the porch of the home they had built together, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. "We've seen so much change," Nora mused, watching the colorful explosions illuminate the desert night. "When I think of that first day in Nogales." "You were the bravest person I'd ever seen," Yates said, turning to look at her. Despite the silver in her hair, the lines that time had etched around her eyes, he still saw the courageous young woman who had stood tall despite her circumstances. Standing there at that auction, chin up, ready to face whatever came. Nora smiled, remembering, "I wasn't brave, I was terrified. But I had Samuel to think about." "And now look at us," Yates said, gesturing to the sprawling ranch, the lights of the bunkhouse where ranch hands lived, the school they had built, the orchard they had planted. "All of this, because you had the courage to start again, and I had the sense to recognize a treasure when I saw one." As the final fireworks faded, leaving only stars scattered across the velvet sky, Nora turned in her husband's embrace, looking up into the face she had loved for more than 3 decades. "Thank you," she said simply, "for bidding that day, for seeing possibility where others saw only shame." Yates bent to kiss her, a gesture as familiar and necessary as breathing after all their years together. "Best bid I ever made," he whispered against her lips. "I got far more than I paid for." They stood together in the darkness, 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life filled with purpose and love. Behind them, the house glowed with warmth and welcome. Before them stretched the land they had tamed together, under a sky vast with possibility. And in that moment, as on countless others throughout their life together, they knew that the journey, difficult, unexpected, and beautiful beyond measure, had been worth every step.